Hello and welcome to the Crisis Cure for Higher Education, a webinar by the National Association of Scholars. Today's discussion will be about how the coronavirus pandemic has created an unprecedented fiscal crisis for higher education and rising calls for taxpayers to bail out colleges and universities. Should legislators spend money now to save higher education? If so, what reforms should they require from our colleges and universities to make sure that that money is well spent? The discussion will build on NAS's report, Critical Care, Policy Recommendations to Restore American Higher Education After the 2020 Coronavirus Shutdown, the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal's Higher Education After COVID-19, and Policy Priorities by the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. Our panelists today include Jonathan Pidluzny, the Vice President of Academic Affairs for the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, Jenna Robinson, the President of the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal, and Peter W. Wood, President of the National Association of Scholars. Today's discussion will be moderated by David Randall, Director of Research for the National Association of Scholars. Our first panelist will be Jenna Robinson.
Really interested in state solutions and institutional solutions that can be implemented, without the federal government interference. And we're interested in responsible governance, viewpoint diversity, academic quality, and innovative market reforms. And we're also interested in today's issue, which is cost-effective solutions. And those are more important than ever right now. With everything going on, I've gotten a little bit sick of the word unprecedented, but that is almost what is facing higher education, is an unprecedented loss of revenue. And those will have to be addressed by private and public institutions alike. College enrollment is expected to be down, particularly freshman enrollment. Some estimates are up to 1/3 of students will be making alternate plans for the fall. And in 2009, during the financial crisis, donations fell 11.9%, and I think we can expect to see that again. Really, all of college's revenue streams are going to be affected by the coronavirus and the lockdowns that ensued. Of course, a lot of Americans are unemployed right now, which means that tax revenue will fall, and public universities will not have as much money coming in from the state as they're used to, because budgets will be very tight. And if the market continues to fluctuate, of course, private giving and endowment funding will also be unreliable sources of income. So really, colleges are going to have to look to reduce their spending, because all of their revenue streams are going to be affected by COVID-19 and the lockdowns that followed. So what I looked at in a brief that I wrote recently that David referenced were some solutions, because for some colleges, this will be an existential threat. Many small private colleges were struggling even before COVID-19 hit. Some will close permanently. I think that is inevitable. We know that McMurray College in Illinois has already closed, and it may be that McMurray is a canary in the coal mine. Because of course, not all universities will be recently affected. I was recently reading a report from, this is a pre-publication report from Sean Mulholland out of Western Carolina University. And he showed that the universities that will be worst hit are those that are in places that were most affected by the coronavirus. And he looked at universities that had openings for fall and found that places like New York City had a lot of openings because students and parents did not want to commit to go to those locations right now. And so the destruction and the damage will be unevenly spread across our universities, but I think all of them will feel this in one way or another. And so some of the solutions that the Martin Center proposed, obviously cuts have to be made, and we started looking at the natural places for cuts. And my own mind went immediately to athletics, because I see that as a tangential activity of universities rather than a core function. In all of our recommendations, we wanted to preserve the academic core of the university. That means preserve teaching, preserve research, and try to make cuts to the auxiliary activities of universities. So in my mind, athletics comes first on the list for cuts. And the Drake Group actually had a good start for that. And I want to echo a lot of the recommendations that the Drake Group made. I think the first thing is a hiring freeze. That should be true across all parts of the university, but a hiring freeze for the athletic department, temporary pay cuts for highly paid staff until we are at a more normal revenue time, elimination of non-essential and supportive athletic positions, fewer scholarships and grants to athletes. If I had my way, we wouldn't have athletic scholarships at all, but that's a non-starter at a lot of universities. So at least pare those down. And if that isn't enough, I think universities should consider dropping to a lower level, a lower division for competitions. And that might make a lot of sense in other ways too. With COVID-19 possibly going on into the fall, into the spring, and we don't know how long, it makes sense for universities to curtail athletic travel, and dropping down to another division helps with that as well. The second area that I looked into for places to make cuts were facilities. This makes a lot of sense right now as well, because we don't know what the fall semester will look like at a lot of institutions. Many courses will be online, but even universities that do plan to be in person will not be at capacity. And so I think it makes a lot of sense to freeze all new infrastructure and facilities projects, and keeping some classes online, which is likely to happen anyway, will forestall any facilities crunches that universities were anticipating. And of course, lower enrollment will also forestall those facilities crunches. And so the need for new facilities is going to be curtailed in this era. And I think spending on those facilities should be frozen as well. And in my research, I found that facilities at most universities are already unbelievably underused. They're not used on the weekends. They're not used in the evenings. They're often not used for classes before, say, 10 a.m. And so universities really have a glut of facilities, and this is a place where cuts can be made. Administration, obviously, is a place for a lot of cuts, and I think this is where most of the savings can be made on university budgets. Faculty, administration often outnumbers faculty by 2 to 1 on university campuses. There are a lot of faculty who don't contribute substantially to academic success or academic programming. And there's a lot of waste and academic or administrative bloat that can be addressed right now, starting with a hiring freeze and, once again, temporary salary cuts for highly paid staff, and a significant reduction in non-academic positions. Those cuts can be concentrated in management, student services, and places where efforts are duplicated. Here in North Carolina, we have the UNC system, which has 16 universities, and I think there's a lot of duplication going on, places where services can be centralized, especially things like HR and legal services. It's not necessary for every school in the UNC system to have these duplicative departments when services can be shared. And the last place that I think it will be necessary to cut, but as little as possible, and I think we should keep the cuts modest, is in the academic core. I do want to preserve, as I said, the academic mission of universities, but because of the scope of the revenue decline, academic departments cannot be spared entirely. There needs to be an immediate hiring freeze. Once again, temporary salary cuts for highly paid faculty, incentives for early retirement. And I think these make sense for a lot of reasons. I think that faculty members who are older may want to take that early retirement anyway, because of course, COVID is hardest on the older population. I think some teaching loads will have to be increased during this time, and there should be a consolidation and elimination of low productivity departments. We have a lot of departments in our universities that serve very few students, that produce very little useful research, and that don't contribute to the core academic functions and ideas of the university. They don't contribute to the general education of the student population. And so I think that while we do want to preserve the academic core and preserve the academic mission, there are cuts that have to be made. And it's both heartening and discouraging to see cuts that are already being made across the country. I think some universities are doing it right, and others are taking a very broad brush approach. I've seen some universities that are saying we're just going to do this percent cut across the board, and of course that doesn't prioritize what universities really ought to be doing. And so I think going forward that universities and state governments should be strategic in making cuts to universities in order to preserve the academic core, preserve teaching and research, and eliminate the bloat in the tangential functions that our universities have kind of mission crept into. And with that, I will turn it over to the next panelist,
who should be Peter Wood.
Thank you, David. Well, Jenna's list of things to do sounds to me entirely constructive. It's also largely voluntary. These are things that one would hope colleges and universities would do without being pressed to do them, except by the exigencies of the marketplace. The National Association of Scholars has taken a somewhat different approach. Our view is that American higher education has already been the recipient of $14 billion as part of the CARES Act, money which was meant to ease the crisis. That money fell far short of what the American higher education establishment, speaking through the American Council of Education, called for. They wanted $50 billion rather than 14. And they've been back now and essentially saying we want another 46 billion. That is going to go before Congress. And if history is going to teach us anything, that Congress is probably going to be accommodating to some of this. Now, my personal preferences, and I think those of the National Association of Scholars, is that the taxpayers should not be bailing out our status quo system of higher education, that the COVID-19 crisis has given us an opportunity to rethink these things. So we presented a proposal that goes in the direction that if Congress decides to shower many more billions of dollars on higher education, we'd like to see that money come with certain conditions. The conditions that we put on it are ones which most of American higher education would find unacceptable. But what it finds unacceptable may not matter very much in light of the necessity to dig themselves out of a hole that is every bit as bad as Jenna has suggested. What's gone on here is that American higher education has felt a steep decline in student enrollment prior to the COVID-19 crisis. And with that crisis, as she said, predictions range from the American Council of Education saying 15% fewer students. It goes up to 25, even 30% fewer students. That's catastrophic for most colleges and universities, at least those that don't have billion-dollar endowments. It's catastrophic because 30 to 40% of the operating budget of institutions comes from student tuition, room and board payments. The room and board payments have already disappeared. The money from summer programs has disappeared. And with the shuttering of some campuses for the fall semester, with the decline in student enrollment as people assess their prospects of actually getting an education on campus, and the shift to online education, which is being received with lack of enthusiasm by a great many students, it looks like American higher education is just in a terrible place. The funds that come in that support regular operations aren't going to be there anymore. And some of the programs, such as the athletic programs that Jenna was talking about, just won't be operating anyway. So to the extent that those are revenue sources for a handful of universities, that money too disappears. The cost for things like buying parking passes disappears. Just about every revenue stream that American higher education has enjoyed is severely curtailed at this point. How have colleges responded so far? Well, the loudest thing they've done is to ask for more money from state legislatures and from the federal government. Some of that has been forthcoming, but not all that much. we're talking about deficits here that amount for most colleges and universities into the tens of millions, in some cases the hundreds of millions of dollars. What are they going to do? Well, they've already imposed salary freezes, they're put hiring freezes in place. Many of them have cut whatever discretionary funding is nearby, such as shutting down building projects that could be shut down. None of that is going to add up, or that will not collectively add up to getting higher education out of the hole that it's in. We think that while I welcome all of the suggestions made so far, the one that we put at the top of our list is a 50% cut in administrative costs. That is just coming in with a scimitar here and wiping out many of the areas of the university where it has invested in activities that have no educational value at all, but are rather meant as either marketing ploys or as political commitments. That's a long list of things: the social activism that colleges engage in, the Title IX bureaucracies that have grown up in the last 10 years, the legions of psychological counselors often matched to various identity groups, the ethnic solidarity groups, each of which have their own administrative staff, environmental activism, which has its administrators, diversity training, the excesses of legal services, the fleets of people working in general counsel offices, mainly to protect these other things that I've been talking about. The investment that's been made in remedial education, which just shouldn't exist in a serious college or university, study abroad programs, which probably should be curtailed at this point, and the various forms of community service. I'm just scratching the surface. When Jenna refers to a 2-to-1 margin of administrators to faculty members, she's not kidding. Universities now are full employment agencies for people who have advanced degrees in silly fields who can't otherwise get gainful employment in American higher education. Many of them get extraordinary salaries. Diversity deans are $200,000 in a year and up. People who work in these fields are not poorly remunerated. Most of them are paid well more than the faculty are on a per individual basis, and most of them have considerable support staffs. So when you start pulling this stuff back, that's how American higher education can be saved. But universities will be willing to cut just about anything else before they cut their investments in racial services, in trying to promote social change as their first job. We've just seen, in response to the urban riots around the country and to George Floyd's death in Minneapolis, many college presidents, probably an absolute majority at this point, have put out statements saying that their response to that is to double down on their anti-racism commitment. Anti-racism commitment is going to mean what? It's going to mean a bigger bureaucracy of people whose job it is to day and night propagandize in favor of crushing white privilege and replacing it with some sort of greater equity. That's not the business of higher education. It really ought not to be the business, but it is now. If we're going to do anything about that, we're going to take it out of cutting the budgets on these things. Well, cutting the budget by 50% for administrators is one of about 26 proposals we've made. I don't have time to run through the whole list, but basically we've divided our recommendations into 6 categories: basic economic principles. Among those are the idea that no bailout funds should go to the universities with the highest endowments in the country. The top 100 list of big endowments shouldn't be getting money. They did get money, substantial money, out of the first bailout. It was big news that Harvard was getting $9 million as a bailout for no reason whatsoever. So no money to those folks. We think that the way in which we move forward with this is to make higher education as self-sufficient as it can be if we're going to have a bailout. The second of our big categories was putting students first. We think that making sure that students are not plunged further into debt for programs of negligible academic content is a good idea, but students already are in debt, so we called for putting off debt repayment for students who already have it until January of 2021. We've also called for a debt buyback program. Right now, student debt cannot be discharged through bankruptcy. We think that a student who 7 years after graduation is still below the poverty line probably should be eligible for some kind of bankruptcy, provided that the university that received the funds agrees to pay back 30% of that money to the federal government. We have a call in here for having universities receive money only if they agree to uphold basic American principles, a intellectual freedom charter, for example, a commitment to due process for students who are accused of various forms of mischief, a First Amendment commitment, which is actually part of the current Higher Education Act but is unenforced, and a commitment to intellectual diversity. We think the national interest should be supported by colleges and universities. And that includes things like clearing out Confucius Institutes and the Thousand Talents programs, the efforts of the Chinese Communist Party to infiltrate and gain a foothold in American education. It's been met with open arms by college administrators who welcome both the subsidies that come from Communist China and also the students who are channeled here by Communist China and who pay full tuition. These are vulnerabilities to America that have been inculcated in campuses around the country. That's got to stop. We shouldn't be spending more money bailing out universities who are really working against the national interest and in favor of the national interests of our adversaries. All these things could be agreed to rhetorically by universities who do not really intend to enforce them. So we put in a provision for compliance that allows for private action, the right of students and alumni to file suit for enforcement of rules when the universities have agreed to uphold those. And we have a similar set of principles for the state higher education policies that I will not go into here for the sake of time. But on the whole, I'm delighted to see that ACTA and the Martin Center and other organizations have gotten into this conversation in very much the same place where the National Association of Scholars is. There is a crisis. This is not an overuse of that word. American higher education is headed towards a fairly substantial number of bankruptcies. There will be colleges and universities that go out of business. There will be others that actually thrive during this. And to the extent that we're in a recession, that will mean that some former employees in the general workforce are going to be looking for educational degrees to fill that time. They should be getting degrees from places that commit to these principles and that offer them genuine vocational skills. That is, things they learn that they can take back into the workforce as this recession wraps up. And I will stop there and turn this over to Jonathan.
Thank you. And thanks to NAS both for the excellent report and for the opportunity to share some ideas, some comments. I think the theme that runs through critical care is that universities once understood their profound public importance. They no longer take it seriously. And that's a crisis for the country, even aside from the financial pressure of COVID-19. If you look at presidential inauguration speeches before 1950, mission statements, you see this commitment to cultivating civic mindedness, contributing to the common good, and it's gone. I think it's hard, and I think we'd all agree that it's hard to identify an institution more important to our way of life than our universities. I mean, they cultivate our intellectual vitality, viewpoint tolerance, the kinds of things that make us into good citizens. They cultivate a shared sense of purpose. They're responsible for the advancement of learning, explosive economic growth, and they've played a critical national security role since World War II. Right, so these really are vitally important to our way of life. No wonder public funding for higher ed runs to several $100 billion a year. It's actually hard to pin the number down because there are so many ways in which the public subsidizes higher ed. Right? I mean, for everything from tax credits to Pell Grants to state grants to federal research grants. And so we are talking about a number that probably runs somewhere around $500 billion a year. And so in spite of this investment, administrators barely ever talk about the public good. And we've scanned mission statements. It gets more rare every year. And so I want to give 4 examples of the crisis that we see and things that we want universities to keep an eye on as they deal with this 5-alarm fire that is the collapsing revenue, right, that COVID-19 will cause. The first is that universities are graduating students who don't know the first thing about the country. Right? Once upon a time, cultivating shared sense of purpose was incredibly important. It makes possible a real deliberative democracy. We did a survey last summer, and we found that 18% of college grads can identify James Madison as the father of the US Constitution on a multiple choice question. 51% of American college grads can't identify term lengths for senators and US representatives, again, on a multiple choice question. Right? And so the civic literacy is truly alarming. We have public systems and public universities today refusing to comply with state mandated civics courses because they say it would be too expensive. And so we filed a petition in Florida to block a Department of Education rule that would allow the college system to bypass the legislature's requirement with a multiple choice test, right? And so I think we need to keep an eye on that kind of failure, right, as we think through how universities are going to deal with this funding crisis. Second, universities no longer foster free and open debate, right? We did a campus climate survey a few months ago, and 61% of students said that they stopped themselves from expressing opinions on sensitive political topics in class because of concerns their professor might disagree, at least occasionally. It's 81% for strong Republicans. Right? 56% say that it's hard to have an open and wide-ranging discussion about President Trump on campus. It's 80% for strong Republicans, right? And so this is a crisis for us. It's no wonder that our civic discourse looks the way it does when on college campuses, you can't have good-spirited debates with people of goodwill who may disagree with you. Third, universities aren't teaching very much anymore, at least not systematically. Right? So there are pockets of excellence, I think, on most campuses, and there are rigorous programs, but general education and programs in the liberal arts and humanities have more or less been hollowed out. Right? 42% of universities, by our count, let students graduate without completing a course that requires college-level algebra. Only 12% of universities require a foreign language to the intermediate level, and about a third require a course in literature. Right? But you can often take a course on Harry Potter or vampires to complete your gen ed requirements. Right? So we hear all the time from employers that college graduates can't write grammatically coherent or correct sentences anymore. Right? I mean, that's a crisis. By all the measures of numeracy and literacy we have, proficiency rates are falling among college-educated Americans. And so the question is, how can this possibly be happening? Right? How are universities abdicating these responsibilities? And I think one of the big things that we have to remember through this crisis is that universities can get away with this because education is the only thing people want less of for their money. Right? This means that ordinary market forces aren't going to drive quality up and prices down. Right? So that's the third problem. I think, as we'll see in a second, I think that the critical care report speaks to all of this. The fourth problem I want to talk about before turning to the solutions are that universities are saddling students with enormous amounts of student debt, so much student debt that people are questioning the value proposition of a college education today. Right? 11.3 million borrowers are in deferment, forbearance, or default on federally backed student loans. The cohort delinquency rates for federal student loans for 2015 and 2016 are 10.8 and 10.1% respectively. So even before COVID-19, we have 1 in 10 2015-2016 graduates already delinquent on their student loans. Right, so I really like critical care because its essential message is that universities seeking a bailout need to recommit to advancing the public good. I think it speaks to all of these problems. And I think if the recommendations were adopted, the academy would be forced to make progress. The reason why I think critical care is such an important document is because it changes the incentives. It changes the incentives for a sector where market forces aren't driving quality up and prices down. And so with the few minutes I have left here, I want to talk about a couple of the most important recommendations that we see. I think the single most important suggestion is that eligibility for bailout funds somehow be tied to cutting administrative spending. We've all read about the alarming increase in the number of administrators. I mean, ACTA runs the website, How Colleges Spend Money, that shows that at most universities, the trajectory of admin costs is going up, while instruction is either stable or going down. And so there's a lot of waste, right? And if universities are forced to pay back some of the subsidy or some of the bailout that they get in the next round, if they don't make a certain kind of cut or at least keep instructional spending stable over the next couple of years, they'll have no choice but to look to make those cuts. But it's not just about the wasted resources. As you guys have mentioned, a lot of the campus climate problems we see today are driven by the activist administrators who control all of the out of the classroom campus life, from the student programming board to residential life activities, even first year orientation, things that really do set the intellectual tone on campus. It's well established that faculties lean left. My sense, though, is that with a few notable examples on many campuses, they aren't the biggest problem, right? The biggest problem is the administrative class that's responsible for the policies that chill speech and that raise the due process concerns. And so without a financial incentive, right, without sort of dollars attached, it's hard to imagine what could possibly drive universities to cut the offices and the centers that don't directly support student success in the classroom. So I think that has to be the focus, right? I mean, safeguard instruction and then safeguard what essentially supports student success in the classroom. On the cost issue, the thing I'd also point out, though, is that it's not just the administrative bloat, right? It's the debt service costs that are tied to out-of-control infrastructure spending, the maintenance and operations costs to run the buildings that Jenna mentioned are generally empty or often empty, and the NCAA athletic subsidies, right? I mean, they, in many cases, add up to several $1,000s per student per year. The problem, I think, is that all of those things are very fixed. They're fixed and unavoidable costs. It's very, very hard to sort of reduce them on a short timeline, right? And so, you know, at most universities, 70% of the entire budget is personnel. And so I think the administrative bloat is a place to look, right? Don't just reduce every department by 10%. You want to cut out entire offices, entire centers that aren't directly contributing to student education or their success in the classroom. Over time, though, right, you want a new facilities plan that calls for shrinking and streamlining the campus, without a doubt. One of the other things I really liked about critical care was the requirement that public institutions incorporate into their bylaws intellectual freedom charters and due process protections. But what I think makes it work is the requirement that governing boards certify compliance, right? So the requirement by itself is something that you can achieve by changing the words on a page. But by requiring fiduciaries to certify every year that this is happening, you force them to take an interest and you force them to ask, how is my institution doing this? Right? And I think that's what you want to do. You want to activate the boards to look for and to incorporate good policies. One of the third idea that we really like is the idea that's already come up, that universities are required to accept responsibility for 30% of the value of student loans that are defaulted on if they take a subsidy, a further subsidy. The reason why I think this is transformative or is potentially transformative is because it suddenly creates an incentive for universities to align their program portfolio to labor market demand. It creates a strong incentive to increase standards, because one of the things we know is that nothing correlates more strongly with cognitive gain than time spent actually working on coursework or time spent in the classroom. And so when there's a financial incentive, right, when universities are going to be on the hook for graduating students who can't find a job, right, they're going to start looking to ensure that the programs that they deliver are actually quality programs. The other thing that I'd mention in this respect is that alumni express very strong retrospective appreciation for rigor. Right? We have Gallup surveys, right, that one of which found that that alums are 3.6 times more likely to agree that they were prepared for life outside of college if they said that they were frequently challenged in the classroom. Right? And so, I mean, students, and again, this is the problem, they want less learning for their money when they're on campus. But afterward, they do appreciate the rigor. And so we need to force institutions to do what they are failing to do when there isn't a financial incentive. Right. I think that probably wraps up my 10 minutes. So I'll leave it at that for now.
In that case, so I will thank you so much. Thank you, all of you. I am going to say the next part of our afternoon symposium is a 30-minute conversation. I don't want to restrain you, in particular if any of the three of you have things you want to say, build on, respond. I guess I would say that in a great deal of these webinars, people are often interested in the very practical follow-up. How does this get done? You know, how do we, and each of you, I think, can speak to different aspects of this, as professors, as citizens, as alumni and trustees, as people talking to legislators, as legislative assistants, staffers, how does it happen? So I guess I just want to sort of cue that up as one of the things for the three of you to consider talking about in your conversation. Mr. Pidluzny.
I guess I'll start by saying that, some of it's going to happen naturally. There will be cuts. We're already seeing cuts. The University of Alaska system just eliminated a lot of academic departments, including sociology, despite many wailing of gnashing of teeth from the sociology department itself. And so some of it will happen naturally because universities see the writing on the wall. They know that they will not be getting the tuition revenue they have. They know that they won't be getting the state revenue that they did. And so I think we're going to see cuts regardless. The question is whether they are done in an intelligent and strategic way. And I think that that's where, all of us as issue advocates can educate trustees and legislators about the best ways to go about it.
Yeah,
well,
I get. Go.
Are we frozen?
Possibly. Well, Jonathan, are you unfrozen yet?
Sorry, I was frozen there for a minute. I guess my concern is that the easiest cuts for administrators to make, the sort of path of least resistant cuts, are often the ones that are most counterproductive, right? So, for example, you temporarily suspend payments into retirement funds while you're on the hook probably to make those up down the road. And so all you've done is sort of extend the length of time that the university is going to be in the kind of chaos that results from those kind of financial pressures. Or across the board hiring freezes. Well, it would be much better to do something sort of dramatic and cut out offices that aren't essential to collegiate level instruction than it is to, freeze growth in the engineering department, for example. What universities are doing, from the pay cuts to the hiring freezes to the suspension of benefits, because they're the easy things, right? And so what it really takes is leadership in order to make the more difficult decisions. And that is more likely to happen when you have outside pressures pushing in the right direction, right? And so, again, that I think is a great virtue of critical care, is that it tries to create the outside pressures that will make it make sense for universities to make the kind of cuts that will strengthen them in the long run.
Right. Well, in that vein, I think that we will see higher education back with its snout in the trough. There are about 70 advocacy organizations funded collectively by higher education, mostly based around DuPont Circle in Washington. They collectively have budgets in hundreds of millions of dollars. That's money that higher education spends in order to influence public policy in its favor. Just like any other industry has lobbying groups, but higher education is deeply invested in such lobbying. Countering the DuPont Circle organizations are the three of us, basically. The Martin Center, NAS, ACTA, and a handful of other groups are actively engaged in pushing back against this. How much can we do? Well, I think small players can have big influence depending on how exactly they position themselves in the political tumult. But to start with our low-hanging fruit, we ought to be able to persuade the millions of alumni of colleges and universities to pull the plug. They should not be supporting their alma maters at this point, especially as they get these desperate letters. I've received several myself from the institutions I graduated from saying, now is the time we really need your help. Now is the time you should absolutely not be providing that help. We need these institutions to be as vulnerable as possible to get any real leverage over the policies that they are pursuing. So let's start there. The parents who are deciding maybe that their graduating sons and daughters from high school should take a gap year, or maybe they should enroll in community colleges, or maybe they should explore the idea of apprenticeships or something like that. They should definitely be encouraged to pursue those opportunities. Again, because it's in the interests of their children, but also it's in the interests of the United States that we do not let this crisis go to waste. This is probably the one major opportunity in our lifetimes to get American higher education back on course. It has been captured by a politically aggressive radical movement. It will happily continue in that path if it can trick Americans into tiding it through this current set of impasses. That said, now how do we leverage the ability that we do have? Well, I think we've got to put forward actionable proposals. When we call for a 50% cut in administrative costs, we've got to show that that's within reason, that that's something that universities can do without collapsing of their own weight. And in fact, you only have to look back over the historical record to see that 30 years ago, universities operated proportionally with way less than 50% cut that we're asking for now. It's perfectly possible, it is reasonable, but we're going to have to make that case knowing that the DuPont Circle organizations are in there every day telling the elected leaders of this country that you would be doing a terrible disservice to the youth, to the future of America, and to the voters in your congressional district if you allowed the various colleges and universities there to suffer unduly through this. So there will be a powerful push to bail institutions out. We have to be very smart, very shrewd, and anticipate what those arguments are and refute them as they come. So that, I think, is the how.
Okay, so let's see. Any follow? Sorry, I'm going to be a teensy bit open-ended. Is there any follow-up that the three of you had wanted in terms of your conversations with one another?
You know, I'm concerned about some of the schools that will close. I'm concerned that the schools that will close are the ones that we least want to close. And so what can we do to, bolster those institutions to make sure that, we don't move in the wrong direction as universities confront this crisis?
So I think a big piece of this, and the problem is it can't be done overnight, is educating the market. Right? I think a lot of people don't understand that the universities you're talking about, they're often the ones that are providing the most value add, the cognitive gain, right? You're actually learning with teaching faculty, right? People who are selected because they're excellent teachers, they're promoted, they're tenured because they're excellent teachers, as opposed to because of their research record, right? And so I think what we need to do is explain that the ranking system, they look at prestige, right? They look at the amount of money that you spend per student, right? And that drives your ranking up in U.S. News and World Report. What we need is more cognizance that it's possible to find an outstanding education for a much better price if you focus on things like curriculum and what kind of tenure processes the institution has, right? And so, over time, right, you teach parents to look for institutions that care about educating students.
I think Peter said, don't give to your alma mater right now. I would say maybe we should go a step further. Tell people, don't give to your alma mater, give to the institution, the small liberal arts institution that's doing a great job that you want to make sure is still around after after all the dust settles.
Yeah. Or write an airtight gift agreement that forces the institution to spend it on something worthwhile.
Yeah, I don't believe in airtight gift agreements anymore. I've seen too many court cases where they get challenged or the university spends it on nonsense.
I would like to see some real pressure on trustees, that's your area, who should be reining in their college presidents right now. Fear is a big factor here, and at the point at which the trustees realize that their whole college could be out of business unless it does something, they ought to take a pretty close look at what the college president has been doing. If the college president has been out sending alumni letters like the ones I just received from my undergraduate institution, Haverford College, doubling down on the fight against racism, at this moment, that seems to me so bafflingly absurd that I don't know why the trustees aren't calling the president in and saying, what's with this? We are faced with a whole lot of issues, but getting serious about the budget would seem to be at the very top of the list of things that trustees ought to be concerned about. And so far, I haven't seen it. And we don't know what's going on behind closed doors, but we certainly haven't seen any college presidents given their walking papers for their lack of seriousness about this issue. And boy, are they the lack of seriousness is real. Just going asking for a handout is not serious.
Yeah, I think what we have found is that the most effective way to sort of activate trustees is to show them that over time, their institution is spending more and more and more on things like administration, athletic subsidies, M&O, less on instruction, right? Proving that they could operate a more efficient campus and have no point to peers to do better. Right? And there are examples of peer institutions who spend less on administration relative to instruction and give trustees models to tell the administration to emulate.
Yeah, I think trustee education is so important because they often they get captured by the institution. There's such an asymmetry of information. The institution sets the agenda for the Board of Trustees meetings. They come with all the data, they put together the presentations, and the trustees are asked to just, give it an up or down. And it's very difficult if they don't have the information that they need to make good decisions. And so I think that that's something that I know, Jonathan, you're working on, and we're working on here in North Carolina. And Peter, I know that you've supplied a lot of valuable information as well, but I think getting that into the hands of trustees is so important.
There are two things that we talked about putting into our report and ultimately chose not to, but I'm happy to see that, Jenna, you did. That is, you went after athletics. We were brave about a lot of things, but we decided to stay on the bench with that one. But great that you did. The other one is that we pretty much steered clear of what to do with the identity studies departments in the academic side. That is African American studies, women's studies, and so on. In my view, they're perfectly useless and could be dispensed with. But I decided that if we went that direction, that would be the headline for the story and nothing else we said would get heard. So I'm saying it now, but the fact is that some of these battles are harder than other battles, and those are two that we decided to sit out.
Yeah, on athletics, I think now is a natural time to think about changes to athletics. Athletics are not going to look the same when schools go back in the fall. When you play a stadium without a crowd in it, or you try to socially distance football. I mean, none of that is what people want to see or what people expect. And so I think now is the time to have that conversation about athletics. And I think that, as you said about administration, we can go back to an earlier model of how things worked and show that, look, you can still have athletics, but let's do it the way we did it 50 years ago instead of the way we're doing it now.
Yeah, on athletics, I mean, there are a handful of schools that generate an operating profit revenue, but for the vast majority of universities, the subsidy grows every year. And so, go to
Right.
the database, right? Pull out the total cost of the athletics program, look at the total revenues of the athletic program, look at the deficit that it's running and divide it by your number of FTE students, and then tell the campus what every student is paying every year to subsidize that NC2A team. Right? I mean, that does actually get attention.
Yeah, I actually just pulled it up because someone in the Q&A earlier was asking about it. There are 24 FBS teams in the country that are running in the black, or as FBS athletic departments that are running in the black. And that's it in the whole country. And the excuse is always, well, donors want to give to athletics, but that's a zero-sum game. Only so many universities can have the winning team. And if you don't think you're going to be that university, you should get out of the game, because, as you said, it is a drain on students. We have universities here in North Carolina where students are paying more in fees than they're paying in tuition, and a large chunk of that is athletics. And it's unconscionable.
Oftentimes, it doesn't even take into account maintenance and operation or debt service on the facilities, right? So you add that to the bill, right, and it's astronomical, right? I mean, students, they don't want to take out $15,000 or $20,000 worth of student debt over the course of their 5 or 6 years, preferably 4, but let's be honest these days, right? If they know that $12,000 of their student debt goes to subsidize an athletics program that they may visit once or twice in their entire college career, right? I mean, they're going to resist, right? And so again, it's educating the market, educating students about what their money is actually being spent on.
There are a handful of topics that we didn't discuss. For example, our proposal calls for refusing to give federal money to colleges that have declared themselves sanctuaries for illegal aliens, and those that are actually giving scholarships to illegal aliens. That's part of the idea that our universities should be serving the American national interest. I know that's a somewhat controversial idea in an era where we're taught to think of ourselves as global citizens, or that we should be engaged in the pursuit of multiculturalism at all costs. But at least at the National Association of Scholars, our view is that we privilege our colleges and universities, and have, at least since the Dartmouth decision in 1818, on the basis that they serve a public interest. Whose public interest? The public interest of the citizens of the United States. We give our colleges and universities favorable tax treatments. We allow the system of governance that puts a public charity under a board of trustees or regents or something like that. We do all that because we view these institutions as contributing to America. And then to have those institutions turn around and say, well, America is a very doubtful idea. It's based on oppression, has been since the start. Instead, this institution is going to commit itself to teaching students that their primary loyalty is to humanity as a whole, and to international institutions like the UN and the World Court, and so on. That strikes me as putting us on a doubtful path, a path that becomes even more doubtful when we see that favorable treatment extended to avowed enemies of the United States, or at least international adversaries. And think of China there, but we also have in mind things like Middle East Studies Centers and the BDS movement, and it goes on. What we are seeing is that American higher education has so little to do with America that the case for treating it as a favored son, as the destination of all sorts of public support, is really called into question. I would be interested in hearing what both of Jonathan and Jenna have to say about that.
I guess I would start with what I've seen here in North Carolina, and that is that it's hard for me to convince trustees that we should keep our tuition low only for in-state students. And so it's a universal problem because universities are so driven by enrollment. It's enrollment uber alles, because that is where they get their money, especially public universities. The higher the enrollment, the larger amount of money they get from the state. And so when I make the argument that no, we shouldn't be giving students from Virginia or Tennessee or Georgia preferential treatment that makes it harder for North Carolinians to get into our universities, I get a lot of pushback. But I think that the people who are funding a university, the American taxpayers, should be the people, or the North Carolina taxpayers, as the case is here in North Carolina, those should be the people and the public interest that it's serving.
Yeah, I guess, the proposal to not make the bailout available to universities that sort of fund illegal alien students, I think in terms of getting legislation passed, that's probably a non-starter, right? I think, and so I think there probably is a much higher likelihood of tying the bailout to cuts to administrative spending, affordability, that kind of thing, because who doesn't see the problem, right? And so I think that would be my answer, right? A narrowly crafted language that's more likely to get broad support is going to do a lot of good. On the question of cultivating civic mindedness, shared sense of purpose, I like what I see in some state legislatures right now. Real efforts to specify that every student should take a course that introduces students to the Federalist Papers, to landmark Supreme Court cases, to political development, where you're looking at the sort of key events in the nation's history. And so I think that that's the avenue that we would prefer to see state legislatures take to sort of get at this particular problem.
And I'm just going to interrupt at this moment. We're nearish to 3, and therefore I want this conversation to be minorly turned into the Q&A. I will read in seriatim, different questions, not in the order they were done, but yes, completely arbitrarily. Please forgive me, people who send in questions. First question I want to send to the two of you from a NAS member who is also a low-level academic administrator at a community college, he says. A missing issue here is the demands of accrediting bodies. They have insisted that we have more administrators and diversity programs. Most evaluators are, of course, administrators themselves. We can't fight the accrediting bodies without catastrophic results. So how would the three of you address the accreditation problem?
I'm happy to jump right in on that one. The accreditors get their power through the Higher Education Act, which makes them the gatekeepers to eligibility for Title IV student loans, among other things. The accreditors who are the accreditors get that power delegated to them through an agency of the Department of Education. That's in the law, and the laws can be changed, and the laws ought to be changed. Again, we decided to leave accreditation out of our report because it's boring to most people, apart from those who had experience as administrators, but it really is something that needs to be fixed. I would also say that having been at 2 institutions and having played a big role in accreditation at both of them, one a big university, the other a small private college, you can actually stand up against accreditors. I've done it. They will back down. They don't want to be in the position of denying accreditation to a place because it hasn't met the diversity standard. The only time that they really want to deny accreditation is if your institution is insolvent and is going to embarrass them 6 months later by closing its doors. You can play bluff with them. I know it's a high stakes game, but accreditors are really just bullies, and they can be put in their place by standing up against them. So that's my real advice.
Yeah, this is something we think a lot about and we work a fair bit on. We see the big problem with the accreditors is that they care about the inputs, right? How many resources are there in your library? How many administrators do you have? Who's in charge of your academic programs? But they're more or less ambivalent to the outputs. Are students graduating, having made some gain that's going to help them lead a good life and get a job that's rewarding, challenging, and allows them to have a family, right? And so what we'd like to see are experimental opportunities to get an accreditation or get your Title IV eligibility based on measuring outcomes, right? Measuring programmatic outcomes, right? And so you sort of enter into some type of an agreement. This is our mission, here's how we're going to measure it, and the accreditor allows you that leeway, that experiment, and as long as you make a good faith effort to achieve the outcome measured in some responsible way, your path to Title IV aid is open, right? And so, the idea would be you'd unleash a lot of new experiments, efforts to provide valuable credentials, important learning at lower prices, with those federal student loans and Pell Grants.
Well, if there's not a third answer to that, going once, I'm going to hop. Oh, you no, okay, no. Okay, so another question. How do you present the decoupling of social engineering to the Board of Trustees as a foundation board director? None of you is a foundation board director?
Never been in that position, so if I were a horse, I would like to eat hay, I guess, but I'm not a horse. How do I answer that? If you're trying to persuade trustees, repeat the question.
Sorry. If you're a foundation board director, how do you present the decoupling of social engineering, from, I presume, the rest of the teaching, to the Board of Trustees? How do you convince the Board of Trustees you got to decouple education from social engineering?
Okay, so we each are the head of a foundation with lots of money that supports the university. I want to go to the trustees and say, we really like your programs in Shakespeare and computer engineering. We're not so keen on your programs aimed at turning students into political activists who vote in a particular way. We think that if you can show us that you will continue the wonderful things you're doing on the side of rigorous education, we will be happy to support you. But if we're going to see our resources, knowing that money is fungible, going into supporting your programs and political activism, we're going to cut you off. I think that's the conversation I would have.
Okay.
I guess I would say, you have to unleash a competition to create an environment in which students start learning something, right? And so at some point, some university is going to start offering some type of sort of test that you can, some objective measure of your competency that you can add to your transcript, right? So let's allow every student on campus to have free tests, objective tests that are out there in the marketplace on 20 or 25 micro-credentials, right? Let them take a critical thinking test, put those scores on the transcript, and reward the departments that are doing the best job with their majors of cognitive gain and value add, right? You have to start changing the incentives, I think, right? And a big part of the problem is that the faculty committees control the academic programs, they control hiring, they control tenure, they control promotion. And so unless you give the faculties that have all of that control some reason to want to deliver a better education, right? There's got to be something in it for them. You have to change the campus incentives. They're not going to do it, right? And so I think you need sort of radical experimentation in changing the incentive structure within the campus and basically everything.
I'm going to pass on a follow-up question. And again, hoping I'm not interrupting other people, but I'm a trustee at a small liberal arts school. I fully support comments read trustees needing to push for balance that isn't there in faculty and senior administration views. The problem is that trustees stay silent out of fear of being marginalized or pushed out. How do we change the dynamic?
No, I
You could
think
solve this.
no, I think it's really hard, especially because a lot of universities, the way that their boards of trustees are set up is that the university they hold all the cards. And I've seen this in a couple of private liberal arts institutions where there are, significant numbers of alumni and trustees who are dissatisfied, but because the universities appoint the trustees, the presidents appoint the trustees, they feel like they can't speak up. But I think that, the first step is, get those alumni behind you, because the alumni are the university. That's especially true of private universities. The president, the administration, that's not the university. The university is the people it has educated, and its reputation and everything that it's done for the many years of its existence. So I think starting with alumni is key. And I should really let Jonathan take this question, because it's right there in ACTA's title. But I think it's
I think
it's a problem.
Yeah, I think it is the problem, right, at the end of the day, right? There's the knowledge of the information asymmetry that Jenna noted earlier. And so I think the answer is that it's very hard and it takes time, and it begins with coalition building, and it begins with building a small cadre of the most informed and engaged trustees. And then at some point in time, there's going to be an opportunity to elect a board chair who understands that at the end of the day, universities are fundamentally educative institutions, right? Not sort of prestige mongers. And it's at that moment where you control a presidential search and can bring in a president who is interested in building a culture that prioritizes educational excellence at a good price. But I do think that it is incredibly difficult and takes years.
Okay, in that case, I'm going to go on to a slightly different question. This morning, my president at Penn State sent out a message to the Penn State community announcing 7 steps that he would take in response to the protests of the past few weeks. Most of the 7 will cost a lot. I expect Penn State is not alone. Do you think that your thoughtful proposals will get any attention in a time of panic?
Well, partly that question seems directed to NAS. So yes, it will get thoughtful attention from thoughtful people. The panic over George Floyd and the urban riots is only one stage of a panic that has been unrolling for a longer period. The panic over the existential crisis of higher education, whether it can afford to exist in months and years to come, I think will eventually overtake the concern that America is a racist society, a slavocracy, as Hannah Jones calls it. That will be eclipsed. And I, as a matter of fact, I saw the statement from the president of Penn State this morning. It's of a piece with what hundreds of other college presidents have been saying. It's stuff and nonsense. They can't afford to do the things that are being proposed. They especially can't afford to do them at this juncture when their finances are in severe disorder. Moreover, they will simply drive yet more students away. Who wants to go to a college where job one is to persuade all of the white students that they are inherently racist and need to spend their 4, 5, 6 years atoning for the accident of birth, and taking the Black and other minority students and teaching them that what matters most about you is your ethnic heritage and your sense of grievance, and your next several years are going to be spent sharpening that. That as a sales pitch might appeal to a very small percentage of students, but it's not where most Americans want to be. And when the college presidents steer their universities into that as the most profound commitment that the college is going to make, they are marketing themselves even deeper into the hole that they're already in. So I don't believe it's going to last. It would be a good thing to speak out against that sort of nonsense, but speak out against it or not, it's not going to prevail.
Going once, going twice. Anybody else to speak on the subject? And if not, another question will be, can you talk about the impact of distance education on university finances?
I think the thing that we've seen already very, very clearly is that students are savvy and they know that distance education in most circumstances is not an equivalent replacement for what they were getting on campus. There are reasons to have distance education. If you need a quick credential, if you need to get into the marketplace, the job market very quickly, if you're looking for something very specific and just want to pick up a skill, then I think online education is a great way to go. But I don't think that it can replace a seminar. It cannot replace the FaceTime you get with faculty. And students realized that as soon as they were, forced from the classroom into online learning. And if you look at what universities were doing pre-coronavirus, you see that they were charging less for their online offerings than they were for their face-to-face offerings. And so I think that if universities try to do all online education and charge the same prices that they were charging, we're going to continue seeing what has already started, which is lawsuits from students or other kinds of student revolt at the content and the product that they're getting, because they know that it's not the same. And as I said, I'm a proponent of online education in places and in circumstances where it works, but I don't think it can be a replacement for everything that a university education is supposed to be.
I'll add that I think online education is not just one thing. It varies quite a lot from discipline to discipline, from teacher to teacher. The courses that are taught traditionally in the classroom cannot be simply zoomed into place as online education and made to work well. They can work after a fashion, but the students correctly recognize that it's not equivalent. But there are ways of using online education that probably enhance learning in some specific circumstances, and we need to be prepared to make those distinctions. Colleges and universities are now in love with the idea of online education because it solves the immediate problem of what do we do this fall. It also has some entailments to it which aren't very attractive. That is, those online courses can be taught by adjuncts that are cheap to hire and easy to dismiss. The problems of having a tenured faculty and all the care and feeding that goes with the prestige system of higher education are suddenly wiped away. One online course in accounting is pretty much like another, and if someplace can offer it for a fraction of what it costs to do it at a major university, the students are going to flock to the low-cost provider because they realize that the differences in online courses from one university to the next are not large enough to justify paying premium prices. So it will be folly if our major universities and good colleges decide to swap out in-person instruction for online education on a broad basis. They might be able to do it for some very specific courses where it makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. The only thing that I'll add is because university administrators know that students are not going to pay residential prices for 5 online classes, they're under immense pressure to bring students back to campus, even if they know in all likelihood it's going to be catastrophic, right? Because they need the auxiliary service revenue and they need the enrollment, right? And so, it's hard to imagine a place where it's going to be harder to mitigate the spread of COVID-19, right? You have people coming from every corner of the city, of the region onto campus. And then, I mean, campuses are built to sort of facilitate overlapping dense networks of students. I mean, you're in the dorm 7 times a day, probably different rooms too, 3 or 4 different classes, the gym, the cafeteria. I mean, it's going to spread like wildfire, right? And then how do you isolate the students who are infected? And what are the faculty going to say, right? Who are in higher risk groups, right? That they're fine going to teach an in-person class in a petri dish, right? So I think that there are strong financial incentives to bring students back to campus, but that it can only go very, very, very badly, right? And so I think that's one of the things that's, you know, we're just going to have to watch it unfold as August and September near.
I am going to follow from that to a very practical question. I'm curious to know whether your organizations have developed toolkits that individuals can use to support your efforts. We've heard about alumni giving or refusal to give. What else can students, professors, alumni, parents, and other concerned citizens do to help affect the changes you proposed?
At the National Association of Scholars, we put David Randall in charge of that, so I think he should answer.
Oh, well, if I must then. Well, we do have toolkits for a variety of specific issues, Confucius Institute, social justice education, reproducibility, I believe. We have regular conference calls, which we were doing about once a month until the coronavirus hit. It's been a little bit more erratic since. But, in fact, we have been doing that. We will be doing that. In effect, we include model letters for how to write to your congressman, and whomever. And we try for our conference calls, in effect, to talk about what, in particular, if there is something like a legislation, a bill, we try to have a model thing saying we support this to be done, Higher Education Act reform, so that people can give the most precise ask possible to busy legislative assistants. So we have that. We have it in effect on an issue by issue level, not higher education in general. Did we do we did, I think, have one for the coronavirus critical care right after it came out. Peter, I believe you spoke on that. So yes, we have that. If you're interested in our kit, please write in, and I might as well mention now, actually, for any question anybody has which doesn't get answered or just in general, please write either to contact@nas.org or my address, personal, randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org. I will forward questions, whether they want them or not, to the various participants of the panel. Sorry, so having said all that, other people, your toolkits.
So one of the things I've been involved in recently, and I think is very powerful, is for alumni to get together and form an alternative alumni group. Working through your university sanctioned alumni organization is ineffective. Those organizations are boosters for the university. And I think that we've seen at a couple of campuses, alternative alumni organizations start to really make a difference. There's one at the University of Texas. There's now one at Davidson here in North Carolina, and a very powerful alumni organization at Washington and Lee. And I think all of those alumni organizations have started making noise and making change. And I think that that's a great way to go for alumni to make changes at their alma mater. And the other thing I would say is, we talked a little bit about giving, but I think it's not enough just to not give. I think you have to let your alma mater know, or whatever university it is that is asking you for money. You have to let them know why you are not giving, because otherwise they see gifts come and go, but they don't know what's causing it. And so I think you have to write to the person who is doing development for the university and let them know the reason that you are not responding to their ask.
Yeah, thanks for that question. On the trustee end, contact us. We're always helping trustees dig into their audited financials, understand their iPads data. We have a sort of a slate of board services that we provide. We've built a website called How Colleges Spend Money, and its purpose is to give a sort of at-a-glance view of your financial data, just to sort of see what the trends are in comparison to peer institutions. So start there, but please contact us, and we're happy to sort of help you dig into, again, the finance data or everything in iPads, hundreds of different data points. On the alumni angle, we run a fund for academic renewal, and the purpose of the fund for academic renewal is to work with donors to structure gift agreements. We can provide complimentary legal review from a DC law firm as well to sort of make sure that they're as close to airtight as they can be. So that's a big part of our mission. My department works on, one of the main things we do is try to educate market demand, right? So we're working with high school principals, high school counselors on college choice. And so we've developed resources that try to encourage families to look for universities with high graduation rates, reasonable tuition rates, strong core curriculum, programs that we call oases of excellence or hidden gems, right? So programs that are run by talented faculty who really care about educating and who have built communities of intellectually interested students. And so those are the main initiatives we're working on right now at ACTA.
I'm going, therefore, to go back to another a somewhat different question. What changes will happen in college admissions departments? To which we might add, what changes should happen, what changes need to happen? And that's, I guess, both in general and in particular in response to the coronavirus.
I think there's going to be intense competition for matriculation, right? And I think there's been a change in the code of ethics for enrollment services professionals that allows people to recruit after someone has sort of put down their deposit or indicated an intention to matriculate at a particular institution. So I think you're going to see targeted discounting in order to just get as many students onto campus as you possibly can. So discount the tuition or give free room if the university has empty residence halls, just in order to raise numbers and bring some revenue with those students. So I think you're going to see discount rates go way up, right? So revenue per student will probably go down as universities are in that kind of arms race to get as many sort of butts and seats, as many dorms full. So I think it's going to be interesting to watch, because we've probably never seen anything quite like it.
On a slightly longer term, I would expect a lot of colleges and universities are going to try to enter into articulation agreements with community colleges to capture a flow of students in years to come, because their freshman classes this year and next year are probably going to be severely limited. It's going to be a nasty business. We're going to see cutthroat competition, and colleges and universities will, as they often have in the past, attempt to recruit unqualified students by cutting the standards that apply to admissions. We're seeing that already on a fairly major scale in California, where they've decided to make the SATs and ACTs optional. That's spreading to other parts of the country. Make no mistake about that, that's intended to make it easier to admit students who really don't belong in college at all.
Yeah, I was going to echo exactly what you said, Peter. Lowering of academic standards is something that I'm very worried about, because if you were a competitive school, but now you have 1/3 fewer applicants, you're just going to go, further down the applicant pool to fill those seats. And we've seen the same thing in North Carolina. We've got a kind of a bizarre admission standard now for the UNC system that was pushed through as part of a response to COVID, where you can either get a 2.5 GPA or a 10/10 on your SAT or whatever the ACT equivalent is. But of course, we all know that a 2.5 GPA is so low as to be meaningless. And so that means that your SAT score really doesn't matter at all. even though it is officially part of the admissions standards, it doesn't matter anymore. And at the same time, the UNC system just pushed through a new math curriculum modeled after Texas's math curriculum, so that it removes stumbling blocks from students who can't do college math. And again, that is in service of making sure that they retain more students so they stay on campus to, just to fill the seats. And I'm very concerned about that going forward.
I am going to ask a comment for which I think there's a question to follow up on. This is about cost cutting. In the public sector of higher education, where most students are enrolled, the pressure to build facilities is as often driven by interest in expanding job opportunities and earnings for businesses as it is by academic program, quote unquote, needs. And the consolidation of services across campuses is often resisted by local leaders, business leaders. I think the follow-up question is, given this pressure, how does one address this effectively, politically, in terms of one's recommendations?
So I mean, board leadership, right? The board just has to say, I mean, you look at how much money the university owes, right? At a university with 10,000 students, it's often going to be $120, $150 million. Look at the debt service costs. I mean, what are you paying every year to hold that debt? Divide it by the number of students and ask yourself if it's reasonable, right? Then walk around campus, right, if you're a trustee, and see how many empty buildings there are. And then start thinking about which ones are old, which ones have deferred maintenance, which ones you can close, right, to save the maintenance costs, and where you can consolidate services. If it's a public institution, state legislatures have and should take a real interest in building utilization. And so, I think both of those forces can be more powerful than, businesses that want to locate themselves in a glitzy new building on a campus.
I think something else that we have to do, all of us, is push back against the economic impact studies that universities and their lobbying groups continue to produce. They will tell you every dollar spent by a university will be, multiplied back to the community, fourfold. I mean, they come up with these numbers that are just completely unbelievable. And legislators buy them, and the local chamber of commerce will use them. And I think we have to push back against that model and just explain why, this is nonsense. This is not good economics. It doesn't make any real sense. And, every time one of those comes out, just point out how flawed those are, because I think they're getting away with using what are essentially bogus studies to prop up, their building and their jobs programs.
Every time a college puts up a new building, it's contributing to the local economy by hiring bricklayers and high steel builders and things like that. But the net effect of these buildings is just a kind of public works project that squanders lots of money that could be better used if we're really focused on education. So there's strong arguments to resist and ways to do it.
I am going to close with one last question. It's nearly about 3:30 now. And it's a technical question, which I think is actually a good thing to end on, because it's worth remembering just how technical you need to be when you get into your proposals about how to fix what's wrong with higher education. And this is there a proposal to standardize what is meant by administrative cost? I'm technically staff, not administration.
We have tried to use the term administration to refer to people who are in positions that are backed by staff and who have administrative authority. We do not have this nailed down. I don't believe that there is a common vocabulary throughout American higher education there is in iPads the system run by the Department of Education, a distinction between administrators and staff. And it's the first place to go to when you're trying to get a sense of the magnitude of difference between these two categories, administrators and staff. But I think the precise answer is that there's no precise answer.
If I were, I mean, what strikes me off the top of my head is look at faculty payroll compared to total payroll, right? I mean, I think that's the easiest way to do it that is going to give you a fairly standard result. And then I'd take non-faculty payroll, understanding that some of it's necessary. I'd add it to debt service costs. I'd add it to athletic subsidy. And I think I would compare that to the faculty payroll, right off the top of my head, to get a kind of ratio to determine, take hospitals out completely. And I think that would give you a sort of a somewhat meaningful comparison, as long as you only looked at a particular category of university. So compare the state flagships, liberal arts universities to liberal arts universities, highly selective institutions to themselves. And I think you'd see something.
Excellent.
Well, I see agreement on that one. So at this point, I'm going to say thank you so much to all three of our panelists. It's been wonderful hearing your conversation. I am saying thank you to you. Thank you very much to the audience for coming to listen. And I am going to repeat what I said. Any questions that weren't answered, any questions that you come up with later, as I say, please get in touch, contact@nas.org or randall@nas.org. And I will either myself try to answer your questions or pass on your questions to the relevant panelists. So in effect, anything with any strife at Threads will be attended to. So on that point, I would say thank you. Thank everyone so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Peter, and NAS for putting this together.
Yeah, thank you.
Grateful to have you.